One of the questions that sometimes comes up in prayer is about why did God not answer our prayers? Why did not God give us the request that we prayed for? We've seen that Jesus has encouraged us to ask God for anything, and the Bible encourages us to bring our requests to God. Well, then how come God doesn't sometimes answer or seem to answer our requests? Well, I want you to understand that prayer is not like a financial transaction where like you pay a fee and then you get a result. Instead, prayer is a relationship, and so like relationships, it's complicated. It can be complicated at times. There's many different factors involved. So I want to go over in this segment how God does answer our prayers. What can we expect from God? Do we always expect Him to say yes? God does always answer prayer, but He doesn't always answer it the way that we think that He should. First of all, sometimes God will say no. And just one biblical example of that is in 2 Samuel chapter 12, where King David, his son, was stricken ill. And it says in verse 16 that David pleaded with God for the child. He fasted and spent the nights lying in sackcloth on the ground. And then in verse 18 it says, on the seventh day of his fasting and of his vigil, the child died. So David prayed and prayed for the life of this child, but God said no. God did not choose to grant that healing. Instead, He took the child home. So sometimes God says no. And if you read that passage, you'll find that there were bigger reasons why God said no. Sometimes God will answer yes, and He'll do so immediately. We see that in 1 Kings chapter 17. This is a story of Elijah. He went to go stay with a widow. The widow had a son. It says in verse 17, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and finally stopped breathing. And so she came to Elijah and asked, what's going on? Why did God take my son? Verse 19, give me your son, Elijah replied, and he carried him upstairs. And in verse 20 is his prayer. He cried out to the Lord, Lord my God, why have you brought tragedy even on this widow I'm staying with by causing her son to die? And in verse 22 it says, the Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. So Elijah was faced with this immediate challenge. He prayed, and right away his prayer was heard, and God answered with a yes. He answered immediately and did what Elijah asked. But that's not always the case. God may answer and say yes, but He may do so only after a period of delay. Luke chapter 18, Jesus tells a story. He told a parable, it says in verse 1, to show His disciples that they should always pray and not give up. And He talked about a town where there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared about what people thought. There was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with this plea, grant me justice against my adversary. For some time he refused. Finally he said to himself, even though I don't fear God or care what people think, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice, so she won't eventually come and attack me. And the Lord said, listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God bring about justice for His chosen ones who cry out to Him day and night? Will He keep putting them off? Now, Jesus is not saying God's like that judge. He's saying God's not like that judge. He's saying if the judge would relent just because this woman was persistent, He's saying how much greater is God than that? But sometimes God is waiting for something else to happen, waiting for something in His purpose, and He encourages us to be persistent in continuing to cry out to Him in prayer because we don't know God's timing. Sometimes He answers yes, but only after a period of delay, whatever pleases Him the most. And then we see that God's answer may be very different from what we expect. 2 Corinthians chapter 12 says that Paul prayed. He said, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord, in verse 8, to take it away from me. But He said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I'll boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. So Paul had this affliction that was troubling him. 3 times he went to God in prayer, requested that it be removed, and God says, no, I'm not going to remove it. I've got something else in store for you, something even better, something very different from what you expect. I'm going to allow you to experience the depth of my strength and my power through this affliction. So the point is that God answers prayer in a wide variety of different ways, but always according to His purposes. We just have to be prepared that sometimes God may say no, sometimes He may answer after a delay, sometimes His answer may be very different from what we expect. So why don't you discuss the different ways that you've experienced different kinds of answers to prayer in your life? Pause the video now and discuss.